Lisa Sturdivant will start out the presentations.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation to be here. Thanks for the clicker. So my goal tonight, as John mentioned, is to kick off some presentations that are going to share with you some information on demographic and economic trends. My goal is to talk about some national and regional trends that will affect population forecasts for the county and have implications for county decisions that are being debated in this group. My focus is on the nation and on the region. You're going to hear from folks who know more about the county and are going to prepare some county forecasts, share with you some county forecasts. But I'm hoping that some of these ideas at the national and regional level will help set the context. I was told I have 20 minutes, so I'm going to do my very, very best and stick to that while also sharing a fair amount of information. So we talk about demographics. We talk about lots of different aspects of it. I'm going to focus on three. The first is household formation, which declined dramatically during the recession and has finally been on the uptick. You can see that big bar at the right-hand side of this chart. Young people are starting to form households again, which means that there's a greater demand nationally for housing, and the increase in household formation rates is likely to continue as our economy continues to improve. And as these household formation rates stabilize, we can look ahead to some of the demographic characteristics that will really shape population growth. None of this is going to be particularly surprising to anyone, I would imagine, but some numbers here to show how the population is becoming more racially and ethnically diverse. You can see that the different age groups are broken out here by race and ethnicity, and the younger the age group, the more likely they are to be non-white. And so as that group ages, you can see we're going to have nationally a more racially diverse population. By 2044, it's expected that the U.S. population will be majority-minority. Incidentally, that's a milestone the Washington region passed in 2010, becoming majority-minority. But in the country in 2044. And the reasons are that we have a younger minority population in the nation. We have a minority population that's more likely to be in the childbearing ages. We have higher fertility rates among minorities. And so there's some implications then for the growth of these populations over the next 3 decades. You can see faster growth among the minority groups, racial minority groups, and actually not just slower growth, but an absolute decline in the number of white people in the United States overall. We know our population is aging. We know the baby boom population is entering their mid-60s. The generations here are maybe a little bit different than you might have seen. We often talk about the baby boomers as one group and the millennials as another group and the Gen Xers maybe in the middle. But I've broken it out here by 10-year increments. So you can see some of the relative sizes of these groups. And this is currently. And you can see that the millennials comprise slightly larger groups than the Gen Xers, and the baby boomers are also a little bit bigger than the Gen Xers. As you look at the growth over time, we find that there's going to be faster growth nationally in the older populations. In fact, by 2030, which isn't on this chart, but by 2030, 1 out of every 5 people in America is going to be 65 or over. And to put that in perspective, Japan's already there. They're at 1 in 4, actually. So this is a trend that's happening across the world. But what we're seeing now is we're going to start to see the older populations growing faster than the younger populations. And there's implications of this differential growth by age for housing demand, for labor market characteristics. There's going to be fewer workers to support children and seniors who aren't in the labor force. There's going to be interesting debates about policy priorities when you have a larger group of seniors in the community. So I think understanding a little bit about those age cohorts are important. So nationally, these population forecasts are driven really by differential fertility rates, by life expectancies. Just a note, in case you're wondering, changes to immigration policy don't have a big impact on these forecasts. We're going to be an older population. We're going to be a more racially diverse population. Demographer William Fry at Brookings has called this the diversity explosion, that this is something that's coming, and we can see it nationally. So how are our demographics here different in the DC area? Because we are different. Metro areas tend to be different than the nation as a whole, and we're different still. In addition to these dramatic demographic changes, we're in the midst of a pretty dramatic economic restructuring in the region, which you are familiar with, but I want to take just a few minutes to talk about our region's economy and how it's changing and what that means for population growth and for demographic change in the region. Very briefly, we lost jobs during the recession. You can see those on the left-hand side by sector. We gained jobs back in the recovery, and we've done a pretty good job at gaining back jobs in most sectors, with a couple of exceptions. But as a result of sequestration, there's been declines in federal spending in the region, federal spending both on payroll, which supports federal government jobs, as well as procurement, which supports private sector jobs. In 2010, there was lots of growth in federal government jobs. People came here in droves. This is what happens at the end of a recession. But we've seen sustained losses in federal government employment since 2012. These are not necessarily people being laid off, but they are retirees where jobs aren't being filled. These are positions being left unfilled. Based on what we see in patterns of federal spending, there's no reason to think that this is going to turn around, that this is sort of, at least in the near term, the pattern in federal government employment. The other type of spending is federal procurement spending. After decades and decades of rises in federal procurement spending in the region, we saw multiple years of declines, and as a result, we saw slower growth in the private sector, particularly in professional and business services jobs in the Washington area, where we've lost jobs over the last year, which has implications for population growth because it means we've had fewer workers actually moving to the area over the last few years. The types of jobs that we've been adding have been changing. Not to put too fine a point on it, but we've traded higher wage jobs for lower wage jobs. You can see we've had faster growth in education and health services and leisure and hospitality, where the wages are substantially lower than those higher paying professional and business services jobs. The average wage in the Washington metropolitan area has declined for 3 consecutive years in a row. That's never happened before in the history of how the data have been collected. So there's a change in the type of workers we have. And we see that in this household income data. We hear the news reports every year, right? 7 of the 10 highest income counties in the country are here in DC. That's the headline. We don't hear this story, though. Almost every county in the Washington metropolitan area has seen their average household income decline between 2009 and 2013. And you can see Arlington is highlighted there. So, that means that we're in a different economy. We have different types of households. We have folks with different kinds of wages. We have folks who may be making decisions based on different factors, different economic factors than maybe folks were 5 or 10 years ago, right? And maybe they're more sensitive to affordability. Maybe they're more sensitive to looking for smaller homes. There's all sorts of implications to this changing economic pattern. So as we use this economic restructuring as a context, I wanted us to think about how demographics in the region may impact housing demand. And I think about that because it's how will that impact their decisions perhaps to stay or move to Arlington? That's kind of the next question. I'm not going to answer that question, but thinking about some of these things might help us answer that. And I've organized this around 3 generations, for lack of a better way to do it, right? So why not? Because we kind of know who these folks are in our mind. One thing I want to point out, so that you all know, is that for all groups except for seniors in the region, homeownership rates are down from where they were back in 2000. This really suggests that there's a pent-up demand for homeownership. And so this is something I want to come back to. I think this idea of a big shift to renters may be overstated, and what's happened is there's been an economic change that has forced folks to delay homeownership a bit. But the fact of the matter is there has been a decline in the homeownership rates across age groups, and to me it reflects a pent-up demand for homeownership that is waiting to be released. And we can talk about some of the factors that might release that pent-up demand. If we're talking about millennials, we're talking about folks, or at least I'm talking about folks in their early 20s to mid-30s. There's about a million of them here in the Washington area. Many young workers came to the region in 2009 and 2010 when we were growing jobs. Some of these folks then have been here a while, right? If they came in 2010, it's been 5 years. They came here and they moved into a small place, and they maybe moved in with roommates, but they've been at a job for a while. They've been lucky because they were here when they got a job. Their wages have gone up. They might have met the love of their life, right? They've aged. So this millennial population that we talk about sometimes as being young and footloose and renters and in small units in our region have been here for a little while. And so with time and with wage increases, they're ready. Many of them are ready for homeownership and ready for their own place. And the question is where? Will it be DC and Arlington where they originally settled? Where they might find higher housing costs? Where they might find more limiting housing stock? When you ask them, they like single-family homes. So it's this question of whether preferences and affordability and proximity to amenities, how all of those issues play out over the next 5 years, because it really seems to me that that pent-up demand for homeownership is going to make itself known among this group here in the next couple of years, the next 2-3 years. Telling you something you probably already know, but between 2000 and 2012, the 25 to 34-year-old population grew really fast in DC and Arlington, faster than the overall population, but not in the rest of the region. Right? So this was a phenomenon that we saw here and we saw in DC, and maybe we thought it was happening everywhere, but frankly, it wasn't. It was focused really in the inner jurisdictions. But here's what's happening. So follow me on this one, because this is a little bit of a mess of a slide. Arlington is the second bar, the light red bar, the medium red bar. Between 2010 and 2011, 25 to 34-year-olds made up 45% of all the population growth. So about half the population growth in that 1 year was millennials. Look what happened in 2011. 32% of the population growth was millennials. In 2012, 5%. So of all the people that fueled population growth in Arlington between 2012 and 2013, only 5% of them were millennials. Okay? It's different. And that's true in all of the inner core jurisdictions, but it's a little bit different when you look, say, to Loudoun County, the light blue bar. Small share back in 2010, 2011, and a growing share as we're moving forward. This is suggestive to me, again, suggestive, that there is a movement, right? There is folks who are looking for home ownership and may be looking to the suburbs, may be looking where the generation before them looked, right? And so I think this is something we want to keep an eye on when we think about this group, this 1 million people living in this region, many of whom came to Arlington and DC first. Where's the next stop, right? Okay, let's talk about Generation X. Generation X, they get no respect, and I'm Generation X, so I feel inclined to talk about them a little bit. Some of these folks, there's about 750,000 folks who are in their mid-30s to mid-40s. That's who we'll call Generation X. Many of them are homeowners. Some are ready to move up, and the question is, will they, or will they stay where they are? Inventory, prices, those are going to be the things that they're going to look at. Interest rates won't be a factor. Whether they have equity in their home will be. New construction still hasn't picked up in the region, so they might not have as much choice, so that might force them to stay put. I just wanted to mention that for some folks, they talk about interest rate lock. That is, if you got a really low rate, you might not move. But that doesn't seem to be an issue. If rates are still pretty darn low. So just get that off the table as an issue. What is an issue is that Generation X, among all the generations, now this is national data, but lost more wealth during the downturn than any other generation, primarily because of foreclosures. So this was the group that was hardest hit by foreclosures and may not have built up the equity back in their home to be ready to move. So will these folks stay in place and renovate, right? Are these the folks with one child in elementary school who may decide to stay in Arlington? Even though they want a bigger place, they may hold out, or they may find a way to increase the size of their home here in the county or in other counties like Arlington. So lastly, let's talk about the baby boomers. There's about 850,000 people here in the region we'll call baby boomers. The vast majority of them, 80%, live in the suburbs. We'll talk about what the suburbs are in a minute. Many will stay in the region. Research suggests that between 50 and 60% of retirees stay in the metropolitan area in which they were working when they retire. So they're not going to Florida or Arizona, and if they do move, they're more likely to move where their grandkids are. So this is sort of this interesting pattern that you see. Many want to downsize. Many want to be in transit accessible locations. Many will not be able to afford to be in those locations. But one upside is if we think about those millennials who are in those apartments now and they move out, will this be a transition from millennials to baby boomers finding a place that may have been housed by a 22 or 23-year-old, 5 or 6 years ago, and is now open to baby boomers? The one caution I have about that is there's a strong home ownership tendency among this generation. So to move to a rental unit in retirement, that would be a shift. That would be a new thing. It may be this generation's thing, but it would be a shift. By 2030, about 16% of our population will be age 65 or older, so we're a little bit younger than the nation. And the greatest number of boomer households live in Fairfax and Montgomery County. About 300,000 live in what I'm calling the inner suburbs. That's the second blue line. Fairfax, Montgomery, Prince George's. That's what I'm calling the inner suburbs. The inner core is DC, Alexandria, and Arlington. So you can see about 100,000 65 plus folks live in the inner core. The outer suburbs are Loudoun, Prince William, and Frederick, Maryland. And then the outer suburbs are the more distant part of our region. So you can see that there are a large number of baby boomers living in Fairfax County, for example, who may be making decisions about leaving their home and downsizing or making a switch, which could thus free up housing and make it relatively more affordable to live in, say, Fairfax than it has been in recent years. So the question, I sort of was interested in is there going to be a sufficient housing for all these folks as they're making these decisions that are really tied to the life cycle? And so this idea of needing lower priced homes because of what we know about wages and incomes, the fact that homeownership will be in demand, but that there'll also be a need for rental housing given lower incomes. And then I have accessible housing in quotes because accessible both to an aging population, meaning with home modifications, that's sort of accessible, but also accessible to jobs and amenities and other things. So, I'm interested in thinking through where folks will move in the region, because a lot of them, when they move, will move within the region, and whether or not they'll find housing. So this chart is a little bit, that shows a lot of stuff, but you see the 2002, 2003, 2004, the blue line goes below the dashed line. That's when we were overbuilding. Basically, we were building more housing than we had people coming in. The blue line is 2.5. We build about 1 unit for every 2.5 new people that come to the region. In the last few years, for every new housing unit that was built, 8 people moved to the region. So that's that big bump there. So we have underbuilt considerably, so we need more housing in the region. And I've estimated we need about 39,000 new units each year between 2015 and 2019. And a lot of them are going to be in places where they have typically been. Maybe not been in the last couple of years, but been historically. The blue line is the inner suburbs. Remember, that's Fairfax, Montgomery, Prince George's, and about 50% of all new housing in the region back in the early 90s was built there. Inner core, Arlington, Alexandria, DC, about 3 or 4% of all housing units were built in the inner core. Look what happened over time. Look what happened to that red line, right? Look what happened to the blue line, right? It seems to me that that blue line's going to go back up, right? And that that red line's going to go back down as a share of total housing growth, right? So if we think about where the housing is going to be built, you have to think that's where the people are going to be. So I just sort of think about this as whether we think that whether we think where we are now in terms of residential construction is the new normal, or whether we think we're going to end up back closer to something like we saw in the 90s. Given the fact that there's more land available in the suburbs, I'm suggesting that we're probably going to look more like the 90s in terms of share of residential growth than the last couple of years. And so single-family housing really will ramp up in 2015, especially in 2016. This is building permit data for the region, and you can see the black line says the share of all housing units built that were multifamily housing. And back in the early 2000s, it was about 25%, 30% maybe, but recently it's been close to half. Most of the building activity has really been in DC and Arlington and Alexandria. And so what we'll see as the single-family side starts to ramp back up again, we'll see that black line go down, which will mean there'll be more opportunities for single-family housing. At the same time, there may be single-family housing freeing up in Fairfax, Montgomery, Prince George's County, making it a little less expensive. And so I don't think and then we have also the information that there are stated preferences for single-family homes. Don't get me wrong, when you ask millennials, they also want to be close to transit and close to amenities in their single-family home. So it's this balance on how those two things will compete with each other. So that was a lot of very quick information, but I did want to be sensitive to your time, and I know there's going to be lots of time for conversation, but just some thinking about things about how first-time home buyers and how the pent-up demand for home ownership might affect regional trends in terms of where people decide to live. The fact that there is a pretty well-established, ingrained preference among age groups for single-family housing. And I'm saying these things as though they're true for everyone, and I don't mean it that way. I'm just saying that when you look at the survey data, there is not a huge shift towards the desire for multifamily home ownership. You just don't see it in the data. But there will be a need for smaller homes, for lower-priced homes, because we know what's happening to wages. That's not a preference, right? If you have a lower income, that's not your preference. But you have to make decisions based on that. I think the suburbs are, when I say the suburbs, I mean some of the more distant suburbs, I think are probably going to see more population growth than they've had in the more recent years. And then I think that there's still going to be a catch-up that needs to happen in terms of the supply of housing. So over the next year or two, people may stay put longer than they might want to, but by 26, the supply side should catch up a bit, and we might see more movement in the region than we've seen in a long time. So that was very fast, and I appreciate you sticking with me. I'm glad to be the first person, frankly. If I had to be the fourth person to show that many charts, I would. So good luck to you all. So thank you very much.